Welcome to Trinity Parish. It's lovely to have such a full house. Oh my goodness, I wish everybody was here every day. What a grand day. Listen, we're just really excited about being able to present to you today a wonderful lecture from a wonderful guy who's published a lot of things. Dr. Justin Buckley Dyer. He is a professor at the University of Missouri. And I'm not saying all of but in any event, we're just delighted to have him here with us this evening. And of course, I would ask that everybody just give him a warm welcome from
Well, thanks for coming out on a Wednesday night to hear a lecture on C.S. Lewis. It's always a danger to give a talk to people who know Lewis well, because there are probably not a lot of things that I'll be able to say that you don't know. But like many of you, I was introduced to Lewis from reading Mere Christianity. When I was a high school student, I grew up in the area, went to Olathe South High School, and it was a public school. I took an English class. It was not an honors class. And so we had a very modest assignment, and it was to go to the library and check out any book and read it. And so we got to the library, and that was all I had to do. And I was looking at the books, and I saw Mere Christianity, and I recognized Lewis's name, and I really only knew him at the time from the Chronicles of Narnia books, but was familiar with those, and it intrigued me, and so that was the book that I pulled down that day. And if you've read it, if you know about that book, it began as a series of lectures that he gave on the BBC. They were radio broadcast talks, and they were given originally during World War II. And Lewis, by this time, had become a kind of public intellectual. He was recognized throughout Britain, and he became a spokesman for Christianity. And so the BBC invited him to give a series of lectures reintroducing the English to the tenets of Christianity. And he does this, I think, in a really interesting way, and he begins with what he calls the law of human nature. And so rather than beginning with a talk on the core doctrines of creation, fall, and redemption, or getting into church dogmatics, he instead begins with our latent sense of right and wrong and starts to prod his listeners to think deeply about that sense and where it comes from and what it tells us and what relevance it might have for the conflict with Germany, in particular in World War II. And I was fascinated by that book, and I was fascinated by that chapter, and it really introduced me to this theory of natural law in a kind of roundabout way, then brought me into a career studying American politics. And at first, that's a kind of odd combination. Lewis is ostensibly, as I'll talk about, an apolitical figure with no particular interests in politics and no particular interest in America, who is giving a series of lectures on Christianity, and nonetheless that sparks an interest for me in American politics and the connection between natural law theory and the American founding. So this is all happening when I'm a teenager. When Lewis was about the same age, when he was a teenager, math nearly ended his remarkable career before it even began. In April 1916, Lewis is born in 1898. In 1916, he is tutoring with a man named William Kirkpatrick. And William Kirkpatrick writes a letter to Lewis's father, Albert, and he's talking about the prospects for his 18-year-old son. He noted that he had remarkable literary gifts, but as he said in the letter, he lacked any aptitude in science or math, and he told his father that that was going to limit his prospects for going to university. And so he suggested that he pursue a legal career. His father was an attorney. He thought Lewis could be an attorney as well. But Lewis was intent on pursuing an academic career. And for him, an academic career meant Oxford or Cambridge. But before he could commence studies at either one of those institutions, he had to pass a test, university-wide entrance exam called responsions. And the test had basic questions on Greek, Latin, and math. Math was the sticking point for Lewis, and so he did an additional tutoring sojourn with Kirkpatrick, trying to prepare for this entrance exam. But he discovered, and his tutor discovered, that he was singularly unsuited for algebra and trigonometry. No matter what he did, he just couldn't get past it. In his autobiography later, Surprised by Joy, he wrote that, quote, "I never could have gone far in any science, because on the path of every science, the lion, mathematics, lies in wait for you." But there was another reason at this time for him to study with Kirkpatrick, whom he lovingly called the Great Knock, and it was World War I. Lewis was 18 years old, and by 1917, he knew that every eligible young man was going to be called up for the war. And so Lewis, with his father, reasoned that an artillery assignment some distance from the front lines would be far preferable to an infantry assignment. And of course, for good reasons, the British military expected artillery officers to have some reasonable competence in mathematics. And so, Second Lieutenant C.S. Lewis was soon commissioned to the Somerset Light Infantry, and he reached the Somme Valley in France on his 19th birthday in November 1917. And it was in France that he fought, he was wounded, he lost friends, including his best friend in the trenches of northern France. And by the end of the war, he witnessed and had lived through an incredible amount of destruction of life and property and of civilization itself. In April of 1918, Lewis himself was wounded when a shell exploded near him, killed a man that was right next to him, and it lodged fragments in his wrist and leg and ribs, and 2 fragments close to his heart. And those fragments remained with him for the rest of his life, but he was able then, after that, to spend the rest of the war in Andover, some distance from the front lines. One consequence of all of this that seems trivial against the broader canvas of the war is that after the war, Oxford waived the responsion's requirement for returning soldiers. And so math no longer stood in his way, and his brother Warney later commented, he said, in this, C.S. Lewis, in this he was fortunate, for I do not believe that at any stage of his career he would have passed an examination of any kind in mathematics. His brother said. So Lewis's weakness in math, which seemed to threaten his academic career, which put him on the front lines, no longer stood in his way. And in hindsight, for somebody like Lewis, it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have made a name for himself and wouldn't have broken out in the literary world. But it's also hard to imagine Lewis without Oxford. And there would have been no Oxford for Lewis without the war. When Lewis then returned to Oxford, after his time in the trenches, he wrote a letter to his father about one experience in particular, and it was when they reconvened with his fellow students who had returned from the war. And they read minutes from their last meeting that was some 5 years prior, with nothing at all to record in the meantime. And Lewis wrote, I don't know of any little thing that made me realize the absolute suspension and waste of these years so thoroughly. The staggering waste, the suspension of years, the incomprehensible loss accompanying the Great War shaped subsequent world events. It cast an immense shadow over this entire generation of Britons, including Lewis, even as an Irishman. And the war affected his life in even more profound ways than escaping the clutches of math. Napoleon observed that we can gain some insight into a man's psyche by observing what was happening in the world when he was 20 years old. And Lester McGrath, in a recent biography of Lewis, notes that Lewis turned 20 years old just a few weeks after the Great War. And so we might expect, as McGrath writes, to find that his world of thought and experience would have been irreparably and irreversibly shaped by war trauma and loss. But this raises a puzzle in a way for understanding Lewis, because Lewis always downplayed the effects of the war in his life. He went so far as to rank their significance in his autobiography as somewhere below what he considered to be his nightmarish experience at English boarding schools. He acknowledged in his autobiography that there was a kind of psychological strategy at work, and he was at least aware of it. He said that he had tried to make a treaty with reality, that he agreed not to think about the war and to think about the war's effect on his life. And so he never really did reckon, at least on the surface, with the war years. And this treaty with reality might also help to explain this silence that you get from Lewis in his autobiography and elsewhere, at least explicitly, about what led to the war in the first place, and that's politics. Before all the enlistments and the training, the trauma of men fighting in the trenches, the physical and spiritual brokenness that occurred because of the war, there were political decisions and counter decisions made by European politicians and their civil servants. And if we think about the First War and everything that's happening in the world, every element of politics is here. There are questions about power and authority and scarcity and justice, insecurity, and a tragic failure to promote and protect a vision of the common good. And so we might expect from somebody as profoundly reflective as Lewis was some mention of politics and some engagement with it. But Lewis was quiet, it seems, about the politics of his time. And if the conventional wisdom about Lewis is right, he remained quiet about politics for the rest of his life. And there's quite a bit of evidence for what this conventional wisdom is, that Lewis just didn't care that much about politics. His stepson, Douglas Gresham, wrote later that Jack just wasn't interested in politics. Warnie Lewis noted later that his brother's reputation was one of having contempt for politics and politicians. And Warnie concluded early that there was a kind of stifling emphasis on politics in the Lewis home when they grew up, that his dad just talked incessantly about Irish politics. And it led, he said, to the long-term result of a disgust of the very idea of politics before he was out of his teens. One of his early biographers noted that Lewis's early subject matter, the things that he wrote about, were political as a kid, and he actually wrote all sorts of things as a kid. He had lands that he created, works of fiction, and works of nonfiction. And one of his early essays was an essay about home rule in Ireland. And so he was thinking about these things, but he said it was those political topics were things that the adult Lewis showed no interest in whatsoever. And the anecdotal evidence from Lewis's own life is extensive, but just a couple of things. In the 1950s, Winston Churchill, when he was prime minister after the war, offered to make Lewis an honorary commander of the British Empire. And Lewis turned down the offer. He thought it was not good for him to be associated with politics, and what he wrote back to the prime minister's office was that there are always knaves who say and fools who believe that all of my religious writings are covert anti-leftist propaganda. And he said my appearance on your list would of course strengthen their hand. And so he didn't want to be publicly associated with politics. He said he never donated money to anything with a directly political implication. He claimed that he never read a newspaper. He once told his brother that he loathed great issues and told him he would prefer to see what he called a stagnation party, which at general elections would boast that during its time in office, no event of the least importance had taken place. He often expressed skepticism and even despair about politics. At one point he called himself a political skeptic. And so Lewis, those close to him, distant observers, all suggest that he didn't have much to say about politics and that what he did say wasn't very interesting. And again, this is a puzzle for me. How did reading this apolitical English professor spark an interest in political philosophy? And I think part of the answer is that the conventional wisdom is wrong, that Lewis actually did have quite a lot to say about politics, but we have to understand politics in a broader sense to include more than parliamentary intrigue and debates about taxes and tariffs and the minutiae of policy. Lewis really wasn't interested in the details of public policy, and he avoided partisan politics throughout his life. Yet we also know from his personal letters, from his education, his teaching, his published works, that he was interested in and knowledgeable about politics and political thought. His education at Oxford was steeped in political philosophy. The degree program that he went through was called Greats, which had a very classical focus and had a classical emphasis on political thought. As a teacher, Lewis regularly lectured on political theory. He did so throughout the 1920s and 1930s. He taught his students the canon of Western thought from Plato to Lenin. And it turns out that he had quite a lot to say in the classroom and in his writings about the foundations of a just political order. So when we say that he was uninterested in politics, it depends on what we mean by politics. But as Lewis knew, the word politics comes to us from the Greeks, and it refers to the business of the polis. And this is a word that's hard for us to translate and to really wrap our minds around in the way that the ancients thought about it, but it describes a kind of comprehensive community and brings together spheres and identities that we tend to keep separate: religion, government, family, school, and business. As Aristotle taught, the polis is established and maintained, this community is established and maintained with some conception, even if it's not fully articulated, about what kind of life is worth living and what kinds of things are worth pursuing and at what cost. And so political life, understood in these terms, implicates perennial questions about human beings, about our nature, about our destiny, about our purpose. What is the good life? How should we live together? What kinds of things are so good that we should require them with force if necessary, and what things are so evil that we should prohibit them with force if necessary? Is there any deeper purpose than mere survival or pleasure? What is the point of all of this? And if we think about it in this way, politics then just is linked to deeper and more fundamental questions. And Lewis did spend his life pondering those questions, and his answers come out in his various writings. In the Chronicles of Narnia, you have a new polity that's founded, and you have monarchs and tyrants exercising power for good and for ill. In Mere Christianity, as I also already mentioned, there's a chapter on natural law, there's a chapter on social morality. He gets into questions of patriotism in the Four Loves. His massive volume on English literature offers sophisticated treatments of political thinkers and themes, including Machiavelli and Hobbes. His book, The Abolition of Man, is about the consequences of our attempt to conquer nature, and particularly conquer human nature as he sees it. And this book that's written in 1943, published in 1943 in the middle of World War II, is, I think, his most deeply political book. And the themes in this book come out in one of the novels from his Space Trilogy, if you're familiar with that series called That Hideous Strength. And it focuses on a nefarious government bureaucracy, this novel does, called the National Institutes for Coordinated Experiments, or NICE for short. It's a deep meditation on politics. And as a kind of side note, he's thinking about, he's parodying English bureaucracies, and this bureaucracy, NICE for short, does actually exist now. It's the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And this is the agency that was responsible recently, if you remember this story in the news, for the decision to withdraw life support from Alfie Evans, who is the toddler who was on life support and had a degenerative brain condition. And the agency refused to allow treatment and also refused to allow his parents to seek treatment outside of the country. And so this is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE for short, this bureaucracy. National Review magazine listed The Abolition of Man as the number 7th book of its best books of the 20th century. And so there's a kind of odd tension here between the apolitical Lewis on the one hand, who eschewed partisan politics and entanglements, and also the author of a book that becomes one of the top 10 books of the 20th century, according to one of America's flagship conservative political magazines, started by William F. Buckley after the war. And in his letters and shorter essays, Lewis wrote about all sorts of things. He has essays about equality, criminal justice, capital punishment, pacifism, nuclear war, unalienable rights, social contract theory, the perils of Christian political parties, meditations on the welfare state, and other explicitly political topics. And he approached all of these things, and I think this is the tension that Lewis himself wrestled with in terms of his public witness as a Christian. He approached all of these topics as a Christian, and he saw them within an overarching biblical narrative of creation, fall, and redemption. Walter Hooper, who was the literary executor of Lewis's estate, described Lewis as the most thoroughly converted man he ever met. And so Lewis's mature reflections, his Christian reflections, on these topics come later in life. But like so many others of his generation of this time, particularly with the war, Lewis had originally lost whatever remained of his childhood faith by the time he was out of his teens. When he returned from the war, he was among a first generation of post-war poets who aspired to be known for their dark poetry. And the first thing that Lewis publishes, actually, that most people I think aren't aware of, is a book that was called Spirits in Bondage. And it was published under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton. He took his first name and his mother's maiden name. And it's a series of poems and reflections on the war. And to just give you a sense of the way that Lewis viewed the world and how he was thinking about the world, one of these poems, the 12th in the book, is called De Profundus. And it gives a sense of just the general tenor of Lewis's work and his thinking. He says, "Come, let us curse our master, or we die. For all our hopes in endless ruin lie. The good is dead. Let us curse God Most High. 4,000 years of toil and hope and thought, wherein man labored upward and still wrought new worlds and better, thou hast made us not. And suddenly the earth grew black with wrong. Our hope was crushed and silenced was our song. The heaven grew loud with weeping. Thou art strong. Come then and curse the Lord. Over the earth gross darkness falls, and evil was our birth, and our few happy days of little worth. Even if it not be all a dream in vain, the ancient hope that still will rise again, of a just God that cares for earthly pain." Lewis's atheism at this time was palpable in his writings and his poetry, and it was rooted in his deep disenchantment over the existence of evil in the world. If there was a God, Lewis concluded, during and after the war, then he was a moral monster. After his conversion to Christianity, which is late in the 1920s, there's actually some dispute about whether Lewis got the date of his own conversion right or not in his autobiography, but it's about 1929 or 30. And after this conversion to Christianity, Lewis always retained a sympathy for what he referred to as the heroic pessimism, magnificently summed up in Houseman, this other poet, in Houseman's line, "Whatever brute and blackguard made the world." Lewis came to realize that the problem with this line about a brute or a blackguard creating the world, this disenchantment with the existence of evil, he came to realize, as he says, quote, "If a brute and blackguard made the world, then he also made our minds. And if he made our minds, then he also made the very standard in them whereby we judge him to be a brute and a blackguard." In other words, if our sense that there's something wrong with the world sheds light on reality, then we have to have a rational standard of goodness against which to judge the things that have gone wrong. For Lewis, this chain of reasoning brought him back to moral realism, and then to theism, and then finally to Christianity. And in Mere Christianity, he wrote, in that first meditation on natural law, that there are two facts about the world, he said, that are the keys to all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe that we live in. The first is that there is a law of nature, there is a standard of right and wrong that we know and can expect other people to know. And the second is that we don't keep it, that we don't live up to it. And this idea that these are the keys to clear thinking about the universe and ourselves seemed to me, I remember it when I read it, as a pretty important thing to consider. Whether true or false, it's a bold statement and a bold claim, and it's worth thinking about. And Lewis certainly, I think, was convinced of this. After his reorienting conversion, he said that he believed in Christianity in the way that he believes in the sun, not only because he sees it, but because by it he sees everything else. And so now a question, tying back some of these themes about politics and the good life and how we organize our political communities and what Christianity has to say about that. How did Lewis see politics? And the answer, which might be anticlimactic, is that he saw politics as one who was educated in the tradition of English liberty. He had sympathy for the ancients, but he was really at heart a follower of some of the English political theorists who talked about limited government and individual natural rights. But there were really two key concerns that guided a lot of his reflections on social life and political life. The first is the reality and importance of natural law. If his generation, he said, which had lost its faith in the Great War, really believed in nothing, in no God, no goodness, then he feared that it would start trying to build a paradise on earth. And it would rationalize the transgression of all sorts of traditional moral barriers in order to do so. And this, for him, looking out on the world in the 1940s, was the central project, and the end result, he thought, that united Nazism, fascism, and communism. And it also, he thought, threatened the project of liberal democracy. And so this brings us to a second point, a kind of key thing that you see in his writings, that there's a danger for government overreach for ostensibly good motivations. Liberal democracies, he thought, were not immune to this temptation, and he feared that the project of concentrating power and trying to build a paradise here on earth would be carried out under the authority of science in England and the United States. And this is precisely why he has a kind of scientific bureaucracy that plays such a prominent role in that hideous strength. In The Abolition of Man, he ends one of the sections by concluding that many a mild-eyed scientist in the democratic laboratory means in the last resort just what the fascist means. He believes that good means whatever men are conditioned to approve. He believes that this is the function of him and his kind to condition men to create consciences by eugenics and mass propaganda. Because he's confused, he does not fully realize that those who create conscience cannot be subject to conscience themselves. And so these are deep and profound reflections on human nature and political life and where we find ourselves from a reflective man who's looking at the world, at least at this time in the 1940s, and seeing Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany, seeing the rise of communism in the Soviet Union. And he's thinking about these questions and what they might have to say to us. And so with some of these guiding concerns in the background, I'll try to leave you with just some big picture reflections from Lewis as it concerns politics. The first is that our political institutions are vulnerable to tyranny, partly because we don't believe in the ideas that built our civilization. As Lewis wrote, the juristic key conception, the foundation of our tradition, are natural law, the value of the individual, and the rights of man. But these ideas depend on belief in the reality of a universal and objective moral law. He wrote, the very idea of freedom presupposes some objective moral law which overarches rulers and ruled alike. Subjectivism about values, he said, is eternally incompatible with democracy. That this is an essential feature of our order. The second, when we stop believing in a natural moral law, he thought we will start clamoring for visionary leaders instead of decent and good rulers. While we believe that good is something to be invented, he wrote, we demand that our rulers have such qualities as vision, dynamism, creativity, and the like. But if we return to the older view, we would demand qualities much rarer and more beneficial: virtue, diligence, and skill. And this emphasis on virtue for Lewis was particularly important because he thought that people would always promise to deliver us from the things we most fear if we only give them power. As he observed, in every age, those who wish to be our masters, he said, if they have any sense, will secure our obedience by offering deliverance from our dominant fear. The ancients, he wrote, sold themselves as slaves in order to eat. So in society, here's a witch doctor who can save us from the sorcerers, a warlord who can save us from the barbarians, a church that can save us from hell. Give them what they ask, give ourselves to them bound and blindfolded, if only they will, he wrote. Yet, all of this, within all of this, a realistic assessment of the corruption and fallibility of human nature, he thought would lead us to try to prudentially limit government power when possible. All that will really happen, he said, when we concentrate power is that some people will take charge of the destiny of others. They'll be simply men, none perfect, some greedy, cruel, and dishonest. The more completely we're planned, the more powerful they will be. And so a question that he asked that seems relevant today as it was in his own time: have we discovered some new reason why this time power should not corrupt as it's done before? This limited view of government for Lewis reflects the reality that at the end of the day, the state exists to promote and secure the happiness of private endeavors. In a couple of places that don't at first sound profound, but I think the more you meditate on it, it is a profound statement about the purpose of politics and government. He said that a husband and wife chatting over a fire, a couple of friends having a game of darts in a pub, a man reading a book in his own room or digging in his own garden, that is what the state is there for. And he said unless they're helping to increase or prolong those moments, then all the laws, parliaments, armies, courts, police, economies, etc. are simply a waste of time. And in fact, thinking about the importance of these kinds of private endeavors, friendships, local communities, church communities, healthy governments and healthy societies, in fact, require the health of those kinds of endeavors. They require a healthy civil society. And in order to get there, and I think this is one of the reasons Lewis de-emphasized politics so much, in order to get there, we need decent people who engage in civic and moral education, what Lewis described in The Abolition of Man as men transmitting manhood to men. And this takes place in communities, and it's embedded in institutions and organizations in civil society. But as Lewis concluded in The Abolition of Man, in this book, as he's reflecting on these topics, he says, we often laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. We don't have the right kind of formative education and formative institutions to have the results that we need for a healthy society. And even so, as a final lesson, and to bring it back to Lewis's faith, that we could glean from him, cultures, societies, and governments, ultimately, all of this, are of only secondary importance. When we mistake this relative priority, if we invest public life, or ultimately even private life, with too much importance, with ultimate importance, then we make terrible judgments and we imperil civilization all the more. And there was a certain kind of paradox here. Put first things first, Lewis wrote, and then we get second things thrown in. But if we put second things first, we'll lose both first and second things. There's a kind of priority in terms of what we value. And so Lewis was, in his own life and in his writings, a humane and classically educated and liberal voice in an era of totalitarian ideologies and utopian schemes. And in this sense, I think he was deeply political, even as he avoided becoming embroiled in partisan politics, and even as his ultimate loyalty and ultimate concerns were elsewhere, and were not in the present society that he found himself in. He often talked, as you know, about living in the shadowlands. He always saw the things in this life as good things, things that are gifts to be enjoyed for a time, but things ultimately, like the book of Ecclesiastes said, that are vanity, that are passing away, that are mere breath or wind, and that we can't grasp the wind, but we can enjoy it for a moment as a gift. And so he always longed for something beyond this life, something beyond politics, what he called joy, ultimately. He used as a kind of technical term for a deep longing for something that ultimately can't be satisfied in this life. And this joy that he found at moments in his life kept him longing for something beyond it, and some ultimate satisfaction that he found in his Christian faith, even as he reflected on these important topics for us today. Thanks for joining us tonight. I think we probably have time for a few questions, if anybody would like to.
I was interested in his observations in Mere Christianity about marriage, which he waded into cautiously because he had never been. But his observation that he believed that when the state got involved in licensing marriages, it was a mistake, roughly. And that there ought to be state-sponsored marriages and Christian marriages, and people ought to be able to look at them and tell which one was which. That seemed to me to be a curious observation, but maybe it has more relevance today than we anticipated that it might.
Sure.
What do you make of his observation on that point, and whether it was prescient for us today?
Yeah. So in Mere Christianity, Lewis has a reflection on social morality and how Christians approach some of these issues. And so he has a reflection on marriage and how Christians understand marriage. And his goal was to be ecumenical. And there was much more unanimity among Christian traditions, even in the 1940s, than there is today. But Lewis laid out what he took to be the Christian position about marriage. And he laid out what he took to be the debates within Christendom about marriage. And then he was very quick to point out that none of this necessarily leads to the conclusion that the state ought to adopt a Christian view of marriage. And then Lewis said, frankly, his own view was that the state should have its own marriage laws, and that the church should have its own marriage laws, and that those two things would be distinct and separate. And he was talking in particular in this context about divorce. And he was engaging the debate in England about how liberally the laws should allow for divorce. And he said, my own position is that we should frankly acknowledge that the majority of our fellow citizens are not Christians and can't be expected to live Christian lives. And so his position was that there is a norm and an ideal for Christian marriage, and the church should uphold that, but that the state need not be bound by it. And he even makes a kind of side comment that at least I would be very disappointed if what he calls very politically incorrect by our standards, the Mohammedans, talking about the Muslims in his society, he says, at least I know I would be very upset if they tried to outlaw alcohol. So there was the sense that, of course, you can have your religious rules, but maybe the state's marriage laws wouldn't reflect those. But it is a tricky question, because Lewis also, as he's talking about the Christian view of marriage, says that divorce, as all Christian denominations reflect, says divorce is something like trying to cut up a living body. That because the Christian view of marriage is that the two become one flesh, that divorce involves a terrible kind of surgery, separating, as it were, something like one body and trying to make it two again in a way that's violent, in a way that's destructive. And so, if it's true that divorce is something like cutting up a living body and it does that kind of damage, then there nonetheless might be good reasons why the state would want to discourage it, at least. So there's a kind of interesting question there. And his good friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, took great issue with that part of Mere Christianity and wrote him a letter to tell him just how much he took issue with his view of marriage and the way that he presented it in Mere Christianity. And it was kind of one of those hot letters. Lincoln used to do this. When Lincoln was upset with a battlefield commander, he would write a very nasty letter and then he would put it in his drawer and not send it to them. And Tolkien does this to Lewis. He writes this letter taking great issue with his view of marriage, and then he files it away in a book somewhere, and we found it later, and we can read it. So we know what Tolkien thought, even if he didn't share those views directly with Lewis. But it broaches this issue, and I think it's one that Lewis is struggling with, he's thinking about, but certainly his answer on that didn't have any kind of unanimity within Christendom, and even in his own circle of friends. And so it's something that they debated.
Any more questions?
What do you think of the depictions of C.S. Lewis in popular culture, like the Anthony Hopkins film Shadow?
I thought it's been a while since I've seen it, but as I recall, I thought the film was very good. it's a fascinating, his relationships with the movie is about his relationship with his wife late in life. And even that, his biographers treat this very cautiously, but it brings up a very interesting point that actually this is another source of tension between Lewis and Tolkien, and it offers a kind of, in hindsight, interesting reflection on Lewis's writings about marriage. Lewis is a lifelong bachelor, and part of the reason for this is that when he's in World War I, he makes a pledge with his friend. It was his best friend that he had met at Oxford before they went to the war. It was a guy named Paddy Moore, who was also from Ireland. And they pledged to each other that if Lewis's mother had died, but his father was still alive, and Paddy's father had died, but his mother was still alive. And so Lewis says, I'll take care of your mother if you die in the war until she dies. And Paddy makes the same pledge about Lewis's father. Paddy dies in the war, and Lewis takes care of his mother, whom he calls in his writings and in his letters Mrs. Moore. But it's a very, very odd relationship, and Lewis lives with Mrs. Moore while he's an undergraduate student. By all accounts, many of his biographers think that they had a sexual relationship in the 1920s before Lewis becomes a Christian. And they have a very interesting lifelong relationship, but even after Lewis becomes a Christian, he believes in the oath that he made to take care of her, and he does not marry until she passes along, and so he cares for Mrs. Moore until she dies. Later he meets an American divorcee named Joy Gresham, who's also an author, and she travels to the UK with her 2 boys and befriends Lewis, and they have a courtship. And it's a kind of interesting, the movie Shadowlands gets into this, but it's kind of interesting testing of Lewis's own theory, because Joy is about to be deported, and she needs to stay in England. And in order to stay in England, she asks, or Lewis volunteers, to marry her civilly. And he does not at this moment think that they're entering into a real marriage by Christian standards. And so he goes to a courthouse, he gets a marriage certificate, she's allowed to stay in the UK, and he does this as a friend. And they do not consecrate the marriage or anything like that. Later, it develops into what he considers to be a true courtship, and they have a marriage with an Anglican priest and enter into a Christian marriage. But Lewis has to shop around priests that will perform this service because, of course, she is divorced. And so there's a very interesting question about testing Lewis's own theories in practice with his wife, Joy.
So Lewis declined the CDE because he didn't want to bolster the view that his work was covert propaganda for the right.
Yeah.
Now, why did his work elicit that reaction, and what can we learn from that reaction?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Lewis, I think, particularly after the Screwtape Letters, which was a very, very popular book that Lewis wrote. After the Screwtape Letters came out, that's sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and for the first time he has wealth coming in, and he's on the radio. Time magazine puts Lewis on the cover in 1947, and they call him the most influential spokesman for Christianity in the English-speaking world, and there's this whole article about him. And I think he took that role and that vocation very seriously, and because he did that, he was very cautious to not publicly identify with a political cause. He thought that that would be problematic. And in some of his writings about Christian political parties, he thought it was problematic for Christianity itself to be identified with any kind of political program. And the reason was because there's probably very limited information that we could say for sure about politics with any kind of certainty, speaking for the perspective of all Christians, right? And he thought that just puts you in a position of blaspheming, that you're saying, thus saith the Lord, when it's not true. And so he was very wary of that. We should make judgments about politics, we should stand by them, we shouldn't associate those with our Christianity. Now, why did people think that was something that would be political? I think it just got bound up with a kind of traditionalism. So you have a moment where here's this guy who's an Oxford professor, who's very cerebral, who's educated and intellectual, standing up and defending very traditional doctrines. Defending the idea, he has a book about miracles, he's trying to address the problem of pain, he has a whole book about spiritual warfare, believing in devils and demons, and the whole thing, he adopts all of it, and he's not shying away from it. And I think that just gave him a kind of reputation for a traditionalism that is often associated with the traditionalism in politics as well. Yeah.
So he had a lot of very, very, very famous friends that he hung out with, breakfast club sort of thing. Were they of the same mindset regarding Christianity? Is there any evidence that they played off each other on that?
They did and they didn't. So he had a little literary circle that he ran with called the Inklings. And it was just an informal group of people who were all writing and working in similar areas and similar topics. And they would get together at the Eagle and the Child. It's a pub in Oxford. They call it the Bird and the Baby. And I found out recently, as I was thinking about this, it dawned on me, they had a 2-pint minimum, they said, when they got together to talk about their works. And Lewis, Tolkien made a comment one time that Lewis only had a pint because it was Lent and he was but then what dawned on me after I saw something when I was last in Oxford, they would meet at like 10 o'clock in the morning. So this was their breakfast pints as they're talking. But no, they didn't all agree. So Tolkien was a part of that group, and Tolkien was a very serious Catholic who is the author of the Lord of the Rings series. Lewis was a kind of midwife for that book. He was very influential in giving feedback and helping Tolkien through that process of writing that book. And so he actually deserves some credit for how that book turned out. Tolkien was with Lewis the whole way as he was writing the Chronicles of Narnia, but he actually didn't like it at all. He thought that it mixed, just from a literary perspective, he thought it mixed characters that made no sense. You know, Santa Claus shows up in Narnia, and just things like that he didn't like. There was a guy named Owen Barfield who was part of the group, who was a kind of transcendentalist, pantheist, who was not a Christian, but whom Lewis respected very much, and they had a very good relationship. Lewis was part of a group called the Oxford Socratic Club, and it had a group of professors who would meet and grad students who would meet at Oxford, and the goal was just that you would deliver a paper defending a thesis, and the whole group would criticize you for it. And that's how that was a very fun thing for them to do. And people who were part of that group were all over the board in terms of how they viewed some of these questions. And so I think he loved those kinds of relationships and those friendships, and he loved people who would push back and disagree, and he loved the intellectual back and forth. Thank you all.
What a wonderful, wonderful lecture presentation. I just absolutely, I do understand it's Columbia.
Columbia, yeah.
Columbia, yes. How'd you feel about that? Do you like it? Yeah. All right. Can you ask him back? Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. By the way, we will be having refreshments downstairs. A time to socialize and perhaps get a time to talk to Dr. Dyer. So stick around with us for a little while down there unless he has to rush off. But I hope that everybody will come down and fellowship a little bit. We'd love to get to meet you and share some time with you. Okay? So if you like, downstairs.